If you knew how things were going to turn out, are there things looking back that you would have done differently? Taken a different route, made a different choice, made a different decision? Maybe you're one of those fortunate few who wouldn't change a thing. Me? I can think of plenty of times if I'd known what was coming because of the choice that I was making, I would have chosen differently. And I would have avoided all the stress and the struggle and the pain and the unpleasant consequences that were the result of the choice that I made at the time. So I want you to consider Jesus for a moment. I mean, Jesus rode into Jerusalem on Sunday, knowing that on Friday the cross was coming up. And it's now Thursday, and he's still got the opportunity to change his mind. I mean, he still knows that the cross is coming up, just quicker now, but there's no surveillance cameras, there's no cell phone tracking, there's no tracking credit cards to trace, so Jesus could just kind of slip out of town in the dark, and he could have made a different choice. He could have quietly slipped away, could have laid low for a while, laid off the grid somewhere, avoided what he knows is coming in Jerusalem. At least he could have found a way to keep Judas in the dark and away from the meal, because Jesus is also fully aware of the part that Judas has to play in this drama. But Jesus didn't make a different choice. He knew what was coming, and he didn't make a different choice. Knowing everything that was coming, the betrayal, the denials, the abandonment, the mental and emotional and physical anguish, the suffering and dying on a cross, even that horrible moment when he turned to the Father, and even the Father would turn his face away. Knowing all that was coming, Jesus still stayed the course. Right? He stayed the course. He followed the plan. He completed the mission that he came to accomplish, which is reconnecting people to God, even though he knew that it would cost him his life. Why? Well, because even though Jesus knew what he was about to experience would be incredibly painful, Jesus also knew that it was necessary. That was the only way to fix the mess that sin had made of his world. And so Jesus kept on course. And he told his friends on that Thursday to get a special meal ready, the last Passover meal that he'd ever eat with them here on this earth. Why? Because it was his heart. It was his heart for people and his heart for you. So let's take a look at that a little closer. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John all record different parts of what went on that Thursday evening before Good Friday. We're going to get this conversation started by looking at what Luke writes. It's in Luke chapter 22, starting at verse 7. Listen.
Then came the day of unleavened bread on which the Passover lamb had to be sacrificed. Jesus sent Peter and John, saying, "Go and make preparations for us to eat the Passover." "Where do you want us to prepare for it?" they asked. He replied, "As you enter the city, a man carrying a jar of water will meet you. Follow him to the house that he enters, and say to the owner of the house, 'The teacher asks, where's the guest room, where I may eat the Passover with my disciples?' He will show you a large room upstairs, all furnished. Make preparations there." They left and found things just as Jesus had told them, so they prepared the Passover. When the hour came, Jesus and his apostles reclined at the table, and he said to them, "I have eagerly desired to eat this Passover with you before I suffer. For I tell you, I will not eat it again until it finds fulfillment in the kingdom of God." After taking the cup, he gave thanks and said, "Take this and divide it among you. For I tell you, I will not drink again from the fruit of the vine until the kingdom of God comes." And he took the bread, gave thanks, and broke it, and gave it to them, saying, "This is my body, given for you. Do this in remembrance of me." In the same way, after the supper, he took the cup, saying, "This cup is the new covenant in my blood, which is poured out for you."
As I listen to that, there's two big things I'm picking up there about Jesus' heart. The first is this: Jesus has a heart for everyone. He's got a heart for all people, not just some people. Now, while that's a theme that we've seen before, it might not be all that obvious here. We read from Luke, but it doesn't matter which gospel you read. Every one of them makes the point that Jesus and his disciples are having a Passover meal. In fact, they spend more time talking about the preparations for the meal than the actual meal itself. I think, again, to reinforce that this is a Passover. But Passover is a Jewish celebration. So if Jesus is just for Jews, I could see why the gospel writers make such a big deal of it. I mean, Passover reminded the Jews of their great national rescue story, the miraculous escape from slavery in Egypt way back in the time of Moses. And Jesus had come to be the great rescuer, so it fits. And then by taking a Passover meal and, as we'll see, adding some comments in parts of the meal that were normally silent, Jesus is telling his disciple how the Passover and how, in fact, the whole Old Testament sacrificial system was actually pointing to him and would be fulfilled in him. So again, that fits. But what does Passover show about Jesus having a heart for everyone, not just for Jews? Well, plenty, actually. And it has to do with the idea of sacrifice. Now, a lot of non-Jews wouldn't necessarily be familiar with the story of Passover. Some of them would have been, but most, if not all non-Jews, would certainly be very familiar with the idea of sacrifices. Many practice sacrifices themselves as part of their own religious practices and rituals. So when they were told the story of Jesus, and then they saw how that part of the story of the meal was centered on sacrifice, the sacrifice of a lamb, and then they would put that together with the rest of Jesus' story, they'd get Jesus' point, that he just didn't have a heart for Jewish people, that he had a heart for all people, and that he'd come to sacrifice himself for all people. All right, in the first Passover, a lamb was sacrificed so that the Hebrew people who put its blood on their doorposts wouldn't die that night. It was a substitute death, as it were, for everyone else who's inside the house. What Jesus is doing is he's saying he's doing the same thing. He's suffering and dying in the place of others, but Jesus makes that house defined as the whole world, all people of all time. Jesus becomes here this substitute sacrifice, not just for some people, not just for Jewish people, but for all people. He's saying that God's plan is to rescue the whole world, Jews, Gentiles alike. That Jesus' life would break so God's broken world could mend. That Jesus' heart would be torn apart so that our hearts could be healed. That Jesus' blood would wash sin away so that anyone who believes in him could be cleaned up on the inside. Let me give you some other Bible commentary on that. John 1:29, "Behold the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world." 1 Corinthians 5, verse 7, "Christ, our Passover lamb, has been sacrificed." 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 19, "You were redeemed, not with gold or silver, but with the precious blood of Christ, the Lamb with no defects or imperfections." Again, all those verses and this Passover meal show that Jesus it's his sacrifice. And the sacrifice here, Jesus is saying, shows that he has a heart for everyone. Because Jesus tells us that he died for everyone. Not just for insiders, but also for outsiders, not just for the good ones, but also for the bad ones, even for the worst ones, even for traitorous ones, even for Judas. I mean, it's interesting to me that Judas was there at the meal along with everybody else, and also that there's no record of Judas leaving before Jesus started reinterpreting the Passover in terms of himself, both what he would do and what he would give. Now, again, because the text is kind of silent on that, certainly Judas could have left before Jesus took the bread and the wine and said, this is not just bread and wine anymore. This is my body for you. This is my blood for your forgiveness. But there's no record that Judas left. So what if Judas was there when the four U's are spoken? I mean, again, Judas could have left earlier, but there's no report that he did, and actually some pretty good reasons to believe that he didn't. And if that's the case, if Judas is there in this communion meal, then I think here's what's going on. I think, yes, Jesus knew that Judas was going to be betraying him, and that betrayal was going to hurt on all sorts of levels. But even though Jesus knew that Judas was going to cause him tremendous pain, Jesus still loved Judas. He still loved Judas, and he was going to die even for this betrayer. And Jesus wanted Judas to know that offer of forgiveness was there and available for him even after all the horrible things that he'd done. Body broken, blood poured out for you. Not for all of you except for Judas, but for y'all, period. Right? Broken, meaning he's going to enduring the pain and the agony and the shame and the curse and yes, even the hell of the cross for y'all. And blood not dribbled out like a little cut or something, but poured out like a sacrifice. Again, for y'all. Not all of you except for Judas, but for y'all. And enough to cover the sins of everyone, even Judas, if you'll just believe it and receive it. Now, if I knew what was coming, I don't know that I'd be in that sort of a spot with Judas, knowing the part that he had to play with that. Would you? I doubt it. But Jesus was. Here he's wanting even Judas to know that forgiveness is there even after everything you've done, if he'll just receive it. What does that tell you about the heart of Jesus? And what does that tell you about Jesus' heart, not just for some people, but for all people? And what do you need to do to remember that?
This bread, this wine, there are more than just symbols. Jesus said that this is his body. This is his blood. A new covenant for us. A new relationship between you and God. This Last Supper didn't take place sitting quietly in pews. There was no pinch of bread. No one took just a sip of wine. This was Passover. It was a celebration. This was a meal for the hungry and thirsty. It was for those whose bodies longed for that which sustains. They looked on with eagerness at Christ, who took the bread and wine, gave thanks. Even on the eve of his death, he said, "This is me, my body broken, my blood spilled. I am the Passover lamb, not just for one people, for all people. My body in death can give life, and my blood is the blood that can save. Don't hesitate to take it. It's for you, for all who know they are sinners. Take it and die to sin. Heal your body with mine that was broken. Fill your heart with my blood poured out, and not just here, not just in these moments, but every time you gather, eat, and drink. Always give thanks, and remember me."
Jesus has a heart for everyone, doesn't he? And he wants us to know it, which is why he put that Thursday evening meal together the way that he did. But Jesus also wants us to know, and this is the second big point that I'm picking up in this story here about Jesus' heart. He wants us to know that Jesus has a special heart for his family, for for the church, for believers. Back to those special words that Jesus spoke at the Passover meal. And he took bread, gave thanks, and broke it, and he gave it to them, saying, "This is my body given for you. Do this in remembrance of me." In the same way, after the supper, he took the cup, saying, "This cup is the new covenant in my blood, which is poured out for you." Now, I want to focus on that phrase, "This is for you." For you. Yes, this special meal does show what Jesus does for everyone and that he has a heart for everyone. But the meal itself is not for everyone. The meal itself is for believers. Because Jesus has a special heart for his family, for the church, for believers. And so what he wants to do here is to give believers some special things that they're going to need for life and for their mission of making other disciples. Which is why Jesus tells his disciples here from his heart, this is for you. Now, understand here that for you doesn't mean for perfect people or for you almost perfect people. I mean, none of these disciples who were there for that first meal had their act together, and they wouldn't. I mean, even though Jesus clearly showed them that humility, not pride, was the way to go, they were still arguing about their place and position in that very last meal together. And a few hours later, when their own lives were at risk, they all ran away and left Jesus standing there by himself. And one who came back then denied ever knowing Jesus. They all forgot that he told them he was going to rise from the dead. And when he did, they didn't believe at first that he actually rose from the dead. Now, eventually, they did grow in faith, but they were still nowhere close to perfect. But Jesus has a special heart for believers. And so what he does here is he takes the time to give believers something of himself and to give something from himself that he knew that they needed very, very much. Now, what are those things? Well, again, back to those special words of Jesus. This cup is the new covenant in my blood, Jesus said. Let me focus on that word covenant for a minute. Because by the time of Jesus, covenant in people's minds had become equated with law. And much of faith life by the time of Jesus, much of faith life in the church had come to revolve around, rules and regulations and laws and traditions and keeping those laws and traditions in a way that made you feel that you'd done enough things right to kind of work your way into God's good graces. Now, there's nothing wrong with laws and traditions. They're actually good and show you a good way to live. But the problem here is that the shift of focus on covenant into keeping covenant as keeping laws and traditions, sort of an I'll do my part and then God, you're obligated to do your part. Well, that led people either to doubt that they'd ever done enough right. So there's always a little bit, I don't know. I'm not really sure. Should there be more I'm doing in the field to their relationship with God? Or it led them to have an incredible, how can I ever do this burden that made them think that God was harsh or demanding or an unloving taskmaster? Or to feel, I've certainly met the minimum requirements. I've certainly done enough to earn my way, which does nothing to address the issue of sins already committed, for which there's a debt to be paid. Or it led many people to be harsh, to act harshly toward those who they thought didn't keep the rules as well as they did. And none of that was what covenant was all about. Covenant actually means, and has always meant, God in grace choosing us. God in grace choosing us to be in relationship with him. God in grace choosing us to be his. And God in grace giving us of himself so that we could be in a relationship with him. So Jesus here says, I'm giving you this new covenant. And what he means by new covenant is renewed. Renewed, meaning back to what covenant was about in the first place. Renewed, meaning a return to grace as the standard operating procedure, both for how we relate to God and for how we relate to other people in our lives, both inside and outside the church. Kind of makes me think of something that one of the Old Testament prophets, Jeremiah, wrote in chapter 31 of his book. The days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will make a new covenant with the people of Israel and with the people of Judah. I will forgive their wickedness and will remember their sins no more. A covenant of grace. And remember, that's a gift that Jesus is giving to believers, to the church. So I want you to stop and think a minute before we go on in this conversation. Where do you need a renewal of grace in your life? Where do you need a renewal of grace in your life or in how you relate to other people in your life? Stop and think about that right now. Grace. That's Jesus' operating system, and Jesus wants that to be our operating system. And that in a world of what I call ungrace, that believers would not only receive the grace that they need to make it through the day, but they'd also show grace to others. And that by extending grace to others, they'd be showing other people the heart of Jesus. Now, because there is so much ungrace all around us and no small amount of ungrace inside of us, it's pretty much impossible to get to that grace place all by ourselves. But Jesus knows that too. And because Jesus has a special heart for his family, for believers, for the church, Jesus in this meal gives believers what they need to live a life of grace in a very ungracious world. Now, another way that word covenant could actually be translated is testament. A testament's like someone's last will and testament. And that's sort of what Jesus is doing here in this meal. All right, Jesus knows that he's going to die. And he also knows that while he's going to rise from the dead, he's not going to be around all that long for us to see that very soon he's going to go back to heaven. And Jesus knows that we won't see him then, but we're still going to need to know that he's around, that he's with us, that he's for us, that he's giving us his grace. We're going to need that grace stuff that he gives. And so because, again, Jesus has a special heart for his family, for believers, for the church, Jesus here does that for us. He makes a will for us. Now, when you make a will, here's what happens. You write down what you want other people to get, and then after your death, there's no more changes that can be made to the will. What's written down and specified there, that's what it's going to be distributed. That's what you get. Now, Jesus wants us to know that the things he's giving us here in this will, that they're not going to change. So we're going to get what Jesus wants us to get. We have his word on it. And as we've seen, Jesus' word is faithful and true and reliable. He always keeps his word. And when he dies, that's going to be put into effect. The will can no longer be changed. So this grace stuff that he's giving out to us here, that's going to be a done deal. Better than a done deal, actually. Because unlike an earthly inheritance, these gifts aren't given only once, and these gifts can never run out. I mean, I think that's kind of sort of what some of Paul was getting at here when he wrote this in 1 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 26. For whenever you eat this bread and drink this cup, you proclaim the Lord's death until he comes. Whenever you eat this bread and drink this cup, whenever you gather for this special meal that we call communion, you get these gifts of grace that Jesus just keeps on giving. So what are they? What are these gifts of grace that we get in communion? Well, it seems to me that there are some fundamental questions that keep running through the human story. Right? I've been a believer for some time now, and I still find myself asking these two major questions. God, where are you? Where are you? Are you still around? Are you still with me? I need you, and I don't see you. And number two, God, am I still forgiven? Am I still forgiven? Really, even after all these years, I keep messing up on the same things in some of the same places and some of the same ways. Now, the grace gifts that Jesus gives us here in communion answer both those questions with a resounding yes. Yes, I'm still here. And yes, you are forgiven. This is my body, my real presence. I'm here, and I'm here with you and for you. This is my blood. Free and full forgiveness, no matter how much and how often that you need it. I died and rose so that it could be yours and that you could know it. My presence, my forgiveness, and a constant reminder of my grace. I mean, those are the gifts of communion. Gifts that you get every time you take Jesus at his word, do this, and come together as his family, as the church, as believers, for this very special meal. Now those things, his presence, his forgiveness, a constant reminder of his grace, I know that I need them, all the time. And I'm thinking that maybe you do too. Especially now in what's a challenging season of life, at least it is for me. To know that you get Jesus' presence, Jesus' forgiveness, and a constant reminder of his grace. Do you need those same gifts like I do? Do you need them a lot? Well, I would encourage you to find a place where you can get together with other believers and get communion. Like a lot. I mean, Jesus has a big heart for you. And Jesus gave you these gifts, and they can't and won't be taken away. So just, come and get it. Come and get it. Experience grace. Experience God. Receive what you need. And maybe as you do that, in these days when hope and joy is a little hard to come by, you might even find a little bit of hope and joy in that as well. I think those first believers got that. Maybe not right away, but not too long after Jesus' ascension. I mean, when you read the book of Acts, it looks like they seem to have come together for communion a lot. Some readings of the texts would even point to that's almost a daily occurrence. And I think perhaps that's why the early Christians, who fully expected that Jesus would come back in their lifetime, weren't totally disappointed when he didn't return. Because they recognized that in communion, that he did. That Jesus kept his word, and that he'd fulfilled his I am with you promise in a very special way. Giving them what they needed to live life of grace in a very ungracious world, giving him his presence, his forgiveness, and a constant reminder of Jesus' grace. See, when we come to communion, it's like Jesus comes to us and says, here's a gift from my heart to yours.